Now that you've had a quick overview of the technologies behind SharePoint, it's time to figure out how SharePoint is going to fit into your existing environment. So planning your SharePoint deployment properly is extremely important. And like I said in a previous lesson, not every organization will use all of SharePoint's programs, resources, and functionality. It's time to figure out the arguments for why you need SharePoint, which in turn will help you to find the right combination of SharePoint products and technologies that's right for you. We'll begin our planning by looking at assets in an organization, specifically information assets that can be structured or unstructured. For now, though, let's just think about an average organization and the types of information assets that can exist and where they might be stored. So we'll start with departmental transactions. This would be like financial transactions in the finance department or tracking sales information at various stages of a sale. These would typically be stored in some kind of departmental application or tool. Then we've got documents, presentations, spreadsheets, and the like. And they might be stored in a user's My Documents folder on a local machine or possibly on some kind of network share. Then there's policies, procedures, and reference materials. You might find those in binders in a central location. You've got job aids and calendars that might be tacked up on a person's wall or a cubicle. How about archived files? They're likely stored on CDs, DVDs, tapes, or on storage boxes that are stored off-site. Important links to resources on the web, they're usually found in a user's favorites folder. Then you've got thoughts and opinions, and they may show up on blogs. Ideas and action items from meetings or brainstorming sessions, they might be stored on notepads or flip chart paper. Product and company information is usually stored on websites. And then you've got email addresses, phone numbers, and contact information, and that might be stored in a directory such as on an Exchange server. So the list goes on, but this is a good sampling of both the structured and unstructured assets you might find in a typical organization. Structured assets are often found in formal systems that use databases to store data. Unstructured assets are not stored in databases. Word documents, images, spreadsheets, and so on are often stored on file servers or CDs, for example. And who's typically responsible for managing these assets? IT departments most often, and databases are most commonly used to place structure on information assets to make them easier to manage. But not all assets, as we now know, are compatible with the structure required by most databases. Here's where SharePoint can help. SharePoint can equalize the different properties of structured and unstructured assets, allowing you to gain full control over both structured and unstructured assets. So let's talk about structured assets for a moment. Structured assets, as we discussed, are often found in the more formal systems of an organization that use databases to store their data. I think of a customer support team that tracks calls and tickets, or a sales team that tracks every stage in the sales cycle. For years, I worked for a company that developed an online performance appraisal system to track annual performance reviews, development plans, compensation adjustments, and so on. Systems like this are typically supported by IT folk and have the following characteristics. Well, they're formal, meaning they're considered the official system of the organization and everyone's got to use them, like them or not. They're mature, meaning they tend to be stable and predictable because a lot of time and effort will go into a proper and solid implementation. I spent many hours with customers who purchased our appraisal software to ensure the application was deployed exactly the way they wanted it. And these systems usually have a wide scope, so structured systems are often used by large numbers of people who have received permission or passwords to use them. So the issue with structured assets is not really about managing them, but managing access to them. And that's where SharePoint can help. With SharePoint, you can customize how users access structured applications. If, for example, an HR generalist only needs to gain access to employees' development plans in this appraisal application I was talking about, and not the entire application, you can provide this alternative access in SharePoint. You make whatever data available you need to make available using SharePoint instead of granting large number of users access to the entire application. You can also supplement structured applications using SharePoint. If your enterprise application encompasses only part of a business process, you can use SharePoint to add what's missing. I think of all the expense reports I've approved and signed off on in the past. That part of the business process was manual, initiated usually with an email. Well, we could have used SharePoint to initiate the process, which could then queue up the transaction in our financial system. Now, with SharePoint, you can link structured data to unstructured data. Now, a good example of this would be linking past appraisals that were in Word documents for years gone by to brand new online appraisal data in a newly deployed performance appraisal application like I was talking about. So this is a link that could now happen with SharePoint. You can even consolidate assets, meaning SharePoint makes it possible to provide a consolidated view of structured data that comes from more than one back-end resource. Now let's discuss managing unstructured assets with SharePoint. While structured assets are typically stored in databases, unstructured assets typically are not. Think of Word documents and PowerPoint presentations, for example. You'll usually find those stored on local machines, on file servers, or on external media like CDs, for example. This means the issue with unstructured assets is not necessarily managing access to them, but controlling them, managing the assets themselves. Users can store unstructured assets all over the place, on a memory stick, in an email, on a file server, and so on. No IT policy or backup procedure can guarantee successful control of unstructured assets. Again, it's SharePoint to the rescue. SharePoint stores everything in a database, thus providing structure. So instead of saving a file in SharePoint, you can save the file's data in a database. Standardization is a benefit of SharePoint because it allows you to define content types for documents and have users prompted for a set of properties associated with the content type as they attempt to add documents, for example. Sharing is a huge benefit to SharePoint since you can make information in documents available to large numbers of people. No more emailing attachments, just share. Backing up and restoring unstructured assets just got a whole lot easier with SharePoint since your assets will be kept in a common repository now. Archiving is also better since SharePoint allows you to define policies for how long a file must be archived. SharePoint also adds security to your unstructured assets. With a secure environment in SharePoint, you not only control who accesses what, but you can also control the unauthorized distribution of those assets. You can even audit their access. And finally, with SharePoint, you can query and search unstructured assets as though they were structured assets, simply by applying properties to them. So by now, you should be getting a good picture of what's possible with SharePoint. Next, as we continue to plan and get more and more familiar with SharePoint, we'll look at how we determine the gaps to fill with SharePoint in an organization.